a little bit. Okay, let's see. Got a recording message. And then today we're going to start with Jerome. Let's see, there we go. These are the questions that I raised last week. What does looking at the Bible as a book, what does that have to do with faith formation? And these are the questions that I suggested we all think about as we go along, even though we're not going to stop and really discuss them. Were the computers, the compilers, translators, and publishers holy men who were taught by the Holy Ghost, or were they simply products of the age? Are there any patterns in the ways that change, in the way the Bible has gradually come about? Can we see the Holy Spirit at work in this process? In other words, can we think of the development of the Bible as a work of providence, a slow-moving act of God that took at least 2,611 years to unfold? If I have a thesis for these two periods, then that would be it. And finally, there's the question, is God finished with the Bible? There have been great gaps in the way it's progressed. We looked at these last time, and we're over here in Jerome. We've looked at the beginnings, how it was developed. We looked at the Torah coming together in 350 BC, and then the Septuagint was translated in 250 BC. And that was really a milestone there. One of the things that I'll talk about, or that we'll think about, is the fact that a lot of the Bible's translations were done by committees of one kind or another. This was a committee of the 70 here. Athanasius didn't so much work by himself to canonize the New Testament, but he sort of made a general practice official here. Jerome broke the pattern, though. Jerome worked alone. And this is one of the interesting things about Jerome. He was a scholar, priest, and quite a very learned man. He had some of his youthful sexual exploits and experimentation in Rome, and he was very guilty about these and would go into the catacombs in Rome sometimes as a self-imposed penance. Then he went to Syria, where he became seriously ill, and two of his companions died. And while he was there, he began an ascetic life in the desert and lived in the desert for 5 to 7 years. Now, this is where we pick him up from where we were last week. This is a picture of the temptation of St. Jerome, and it's a very popular subject in Western art in medieval and Renaissance times. The party girls here on the left represent either Jerome's own nightmares or of demons tempting him while he was meditating. He tells us that he was tempted and was meditating frequently on the crucifix. But you'll see here a skull, which is a frequent part of the depictions of Jerome. And then we will also see here in that yellow circle, a stone. The stone represents what was called mortification of the flesh. And so Jerome was conscious of a dualistic nature of human beings, one the flesh and the other the spirit, which is a kind of a Platonic idea, but here he's meditating on the crucifix. He's with the representation of the flesh as opposed to the spirit and the skull and the stone, which he uses to beat his breast. Now here's another painting of that same theme. You see Jerome here with Venus and the Cupids all around him. So he's being tempted here with the flesh. But again, you see the crucifix and the reminder that he's mortal, that it's the soul that counts, the spirit, and not the flesh. And down here, we see another common icon in paintings of Jerome, and that is a lion. There's a story that Jerome was either in the desert or at a monastery, and a lion approached him. The lion was crippled by a thorn in his paw, and Jerome removed that. That's, of course, a very common story. It reminds you of Andronicles and the lion from the Greek stories. But the lion here probably is a symbol of wrath, a symbol of anger. And Jerome's taming the lion suggests that while he was in the desert, he brought his tendency toward anger under control. And so it's these three icons. Here's the stone in this painting by Titian. Here's the lion over here. I don't see a skull in this one, but of course, here's the crucifix, and here's the great Bible that Jerome was working on. He started while he was in Rome, thinking about doing the translation, but in fact, the Pope there in Rome Pope Damasus urged him to undertake a uniform and dependable translation of the Latin scriptures that were all over the place. And so he did that while he was in Rome. But when he got to Syria, he kept that up and followed through on and made it his life project. He went back to Syria, but he didn't stay there for very long. He traveled to Palestine and Egypt. He studied at Alexandria and learned and studied Greek. And then while he moved to Bethlehem for the rest of his life, where he learned Hebrew. As a letter writer, Jerome could be caustic, even with St. Augustine, with whom he disagreed on occasion. In fact, Damien Searles called him by far the crabbiest of our church fathers. I sort of like the idea that our church fathers, at least one of them, could be crabby. But Jerome was inspired. This is him pictured with the angel. You can see the skull there is still there, but it's the angel with a trumpet. In fact, representing the Spirit of God with him, really, while he's working on this translation. Now, what was he doing? He was working directly from the Hebrew and directly from the Greek and directly from earlier Old Latin versions of the Old and New Testaments. He gathered as many sources as he could and put them into Latin, which a standard version. And it was the standard version from 405 AD when he finished it until basically 1545, and it's still in use. It was designated the official Latin Bible of the Roman Catholic Church, and it's still in use. And many believe that it was inspired by angels. It was not called the Vulgate until the 13th century. And what that means is simply in the language of the common people. So for over 1,000 years, it was the most commonly used edition of the most influential text in Western Europe. And in fact, it was for 1,000 years the only version of the Bible that most Europeans ever encountered. So why was it important? It was the first full closed canon Christian Bible in a single language. Closed canon means that by then, the 66 books of the Bible had been settled on. But Jerome's included the Apocrypha, which was translated in the Septuagint. It was based on the best scholarship of its day and was written expertly in Latin, the new language of Christianity. Its excellence made the many lesser and inaccurate rendings, those are in Latin, of the Old Testament and New Testament obsolete. So it standardized it. It helped maintain the unity of the Christian church after the fall of Rome. So when there is no one to express, to do anything official throughout the church, when Christianity was essentially disparate, it maintained the unity of the church. And as the standard Bible in the Western world for centuries, it became the starting point of every future translation in all of the European languages. And so it was a monumental, probably the monumental work in the translation of the Bible. Now we've gotten up here to St. Jerome, and so the rest of the time today we're going to look at the English Bible from Jerome to King James. The New Testament was canonized in 350. St. Jerome did the Vulgate in 400. And here at about the same time, the English language was developing into a discrete language. And so in the beginnings, after that, we had Old English to about 1100, Middle English to 1500, and Modern English since then. So we'll go down this route here and talk about Cadman and Bede, which are really the representatives of what we had of the Bible during the Old English period. And we'll get to these people later on. Rome controlled Britain since 43 AD. Julius Caesar went into Britain and conquered it in 55 AD, but Rome was a British province, just like Palestine. It was not as important, it was not as well populated, but it was settled. There were roads, there were amphitheaters, there were forts, there were all kinds of baths, things like that in Britain before the Romans got there. So when the Romans, before the Romans got there, there were probably some settlements that earlier Christians, earlier during the Roman Empire, brought to, especially along the Irish coasts and Wales and here, that the Romans didn't really develop when they got there. The Angles, Jutes, and Saxons came there and stayed there for 400 years. They didn't leave Britain until 410. So about 50 years after the Romans left, these invasions began. and they destroyed most or many pockets of Christianity in Britain, but some Christian communities were left throughout here. So these invaders, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, set up 7 kingdoms in this part of Britain, which were most unified under Alfred in 900. But the Anglo-Saxons were in the process of learning Christianity from the Christians who were there. So the Christians who were there, the Britons who were there, were Romans and Christians, were very slowly integrating into the Anglo-Saxon world and were teaching Anglo-Saxon about Christianity, if that makes sense. And so there were a lot of Anglo-Saxons who picked up Christianity, if not from the Romans themselves, then from the Britons that were there before the Romans. Now in 597, Rome sent a new ambassador, a different St. Augustine, but this was before 597, really. Now this is what Old English looks like. This looks like a foreign language, but it's really Old English. It's Anglo-Saxon, and it's the Lord's Prayer, of course. And so this is what it sounds like.
Father ore, thithu art on heavenum, sit in name ye hallowed, to be cometh in riche, ye wortheth in willa on earth and swaswa on heavenum. Orne ye de gwamliken rafsilis te deg, and forgiveth our guiltas, swaswa we forgiveth orum guiltendum, and ne ye lead to us unto consnunga, acalesis of ye felle, sothliche.
Okay, did you understand that? I didn't warn you. I've got a couple of audio things and a video. Could you all hear that okay? Good. I wasn't sure how loud that would be. Okay, let's see. We're going up here then to the Venerable Bede. Bede was one of the, in fact, the most important of the Anglo-Saxon scholars. He died in 735. He lived from 673. So he lived toward the end of that Anglo-Saxon period. But he was a monk in a monastery there in northern England. He wrote 45 books in Latin, including 30 biblical commentaries, and was recognized as a doctor of the church. However, his most famous work was the ecclesiastical history of the English people, and he's known as the father of English history. He wrote a history of the church in England before 735. And this is where we get much of our understanding and knowledge of what life was like in Anglo-Saxon England. Even though he was a monk, he was primarily a what you would call, I guess, a civil historian rather than a practicing monk, but he did do that. His one translation was the Gospel of John into Anglo-Saxon. It's interesting, I think, that he would choose the Gospel of John out of everything in the Bible to translate. It must have been his favorite. Unfortunately, it's now lost, and so we don't have it. This is the monastery where he lived and worked, the Church of St. Peter and the Monastery of St. Paul right there at Jarrow. He entered the monastery and was educated there. He was ordained as a priest at age 30 and spent almost all of his life there as a Benedictine monk. He did not travel around the empire. He did not live in a bishop's palace. He lived pretty much there for the rest of his life. It's interesting that in 686, a plague broke out there at Jarrow in the monastery, and there were only 2 monks that survived and were able to sing the full offices of the Mass. And one of them was Bede at age 14. He was not yet a priest, but these 2 managed to keep the monastery going with the liturgy until others could be trained. It's interesting that he lived there simply and modestly all his life, even though he was well known as a scholar. Here's a painting from 1902 of Bede translating the Gospel of John on his deathbed. One of the stories that Bede tells us is about a monk named Cadman. And Cadman was at a different monastery not far from Jarrow, but the lives of Bede and of Cadman were sort of typical of how translations were being done throughout Britain during the Anglo-Saxon period. So this is not, Bede certainly was not a Jerome, but this is the way translations were working. They were growing up. There was no pope to tell Jerome to do the translation, but the need of translations was being felt throughout many monasteries throughout Europe. Now, Cadman, everything we know about Cadman, Bede tells us in the Ecclesiastical History. And I love this story about Cadman. Cadman was a herdsman and then a monk at Whitby on the coast of northern Yorkshire. And this is what Whitby looks like today. But while he was a herdsman, at night, the monks would gather around the fire and entertain themselves by passing a lyre around the circle. And whoever had the lyre would have to tell a story or recite a poem or sing a song. And so this was a common practice of the monks there. But Cadman wasn't a monk, although he sat with them, and he wasn't well educated, and he wasn't really very able to do much of anything scholarly with them. So when the time came for him to receive the lyre, he would excuse himself so as not to be embarrassed and move toward, leave the circle and go out to the stable. And so this was something that the other monks expected Cadman to do. So one night he fell asleep in the stable. This is the picture on the left. And while asleep, an angel appeared to him and he said, "Cadman, sing me a song." And Cadman said, "You're talking to the wrong man. I can't." The angel said, "Cadman, sing me a song." And he said, "I can't." He said, "Yes, you can. I'll teach you." And so Cadman learned the song from the angel and went back to sleep. So the next night, when the lyre came around to Cadman after supper, he took it and he sang his song. And the rest of the monks were completely dumbfounded. "Cadman, you've been holding out on us all this time. Where did you learn to sing?" And he said, "Oh, an angel taught me." And the Cadmans raised their eyebrows and said, "Really, Cadman, don't give us that. We, angels haven't been around for a long time, and you'd better stop this heresy." And Cadman said, "No, no, it's true." He said, "We'll take you to the abbess." The chief of the monastery there was Abbess Hilda. "We'll take you to the abbess if you don't stop this." But he went before the abbess, and the abbess said, "Well, let me hear it, Cadman." And she heard it, and this was the first poem by the first English poem by anyone whose name we know in the English language. And so the abbess got a blessing from the bishops, and they told him to study to be a monk. And so sooner or later, Cadman earned his place around the circle as a monk, and he continued to write other poems that were inspired. So I love that story. Now, this is the hymn of creation, which is that first song that Cadman sang. And this is what Bede tells us. And it's the hymn of creation. Now we should praise heaven kingdom's guardian, and so forth. And this is the way poetry looked like in Old English. Now, I've got a video here that I can play for you. It takes about 2 minutes, I think. And it's this man, Lucas Pappenfusklin. And I think he's an Icelander, performing Cadman's hymn of creation. Let's see if it works.
Du skjulan erian heffen riches word, med hennes mäkter and his morgething, where hulur feder swae undragi way. Et ci dritten oran staride, her is op jella Bernum. Even til Rofa, her ik skipen. Amiden Mongines word, et ci dritten after tjode, firen vollen vrij allmächtig.
Well, he makes a pretty good Cadman, I think. I don't think any of that music was written down as music, but it may be close. So the poem itself in Middle English, I don't know whether you read that. Now we should praise heaven kingdom's guardian, the maker's might and his mind thoughts, the work of the glory Father, as he of wonders of each, eternal Lord, a beginning established. He first shaped for men's sons heaven as a roof, the holy creator. Then middle earth, mankind's guardian, eternal Lord, after prepared for men the earth, the Lord Almighty. So it's interesting that this is how Christianity was represented in that Anglo-Saxon period. Okay, this is Cadman. I wanted to go next to someone that you've probably never heard of, Stephen Langton, who came right here in 1228. And perhaps you'll get a sense of why I chose him in just a minute. Stephen Langton contributed to modern English Bibles in only one way. He was the first person to put chapter numbers into a Bible, the Paris Vulgate. However, he was known in his day as the Archbishop of Canterbury who drafted the Magna Carta. He basically wrote the Magna Carta and was allied with the barons against King John. Now, while he was teaching at the University of Paris, he discovered that his students, each with different copies of the Vulgate, needed a way to go quickly to the text under discussion. Can you imagine teaching a Bible class without being able to say, okay, go to John 3:16, and they'd all have to shuffle through and find it. There were no chapter numbers, no verses, nothing. And so Langdon did this as a professor to get that done. He didn't put verses in it. He used the letters A through G to indicate portions of chapters, but the length of chapter was so uneven in the Vulgate, especially in the Psalms, that it caused problems. And so verse numbers were later added by someone else, but the chapters designation are ones that we still use. Now, does anybody recognize this statue of Stephen Langdon? It's in North Carolina. It is the statue at Person Hall in UNC Chapel Hill. And it got to Chapel Hill, an interesting story. A woman named Catherine Arrington was president of the North Carolina Art Society in 1933, and she happened to be visiting the American ambassador in London, who was her friend. And she saw this statue lying out on the street corner in London. It had been taken down from the Tower of Big Ben, but was deteriorating and was ready to be discarded. So she scavenged it, brought it back to North Carolina, and there it sits to this day. So when you go there, you can amaze your friends by telling them what Stephen Langdon contributed to the Bible. Okay, that brings us up to John Wycliffe, who made a significant contribution to the Bible. He was a priest, an Oxford scholar, theologian, philosopher, and a reformer. Now, he lived in 1328 to 1384. He was past the time of Old English, so the language that he learned and knew was Middle English. And as a priest, which is unusual, he was a strong believer that Englishmen need to read the scripture in their own language. He said, Englishmen learn Christ's law best in English. Moses heard God's law in his own tongue, and so did Christ's apostles. And so Wycliffe set out to translate the scriptures into Middle English. And so he came out with a translation and presented it to the church, and the church was horrified. The church said the scriptures, by this translation or in this translation, the scriptures have become vulgar. They are no more available to lay and even to women who can read than they were to learned scholars who have a high intelligence. So the pearl of the gospel is scattered and trodden underfoot by swine. This is what the church considered. That's the Vulgate was still in use by that time, and it was the language of Latin. It was the language of Rome. It was the language of the church. And here Wycliffe was demeaning it, by translating it into something that even uneducated people could read. And so the church brought Wycliffe to trial before the Bishop of London in 1377. And this mural is on the wall of the town hall of Manchester, England. And it was painted in 1886 by Ford Madox Brown. But you can see Wycliffe standing here on trial before the bishop. This is Wycliffe. This is the Bishop of London, William Courtney. And this is John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. Now, what does he have to do with it? Well, John of Gaunt happened to be the richest man in England at the time, and his wealth was being threatened by the king, who wanted it for himself. And also in 1377, the Pope wanted money from England. And so the Pope Gregory was demanding financial support. And so John of Gaunt was he was a prince. He was the son of Edward III. He was the father of Henry IV, who was the richest man in England and a patron of both Wycliffe and Chaucer. Here's Chaucer in this painting. So it's interesting that you should get Chaucer and Wycliffe, who were contemporaries, being defended by John of Gaunt, who was sticking up for English money to stay in England before the bishop there. But at any rate, at this hearing, this hearing broke up in kind of a riot. It became so unruly that they had to sort of dissolve it. But in a later hearing, a private hearing before the Archbishop, Wycliffe said that I am ready to defend my convictions even under death. I have followed the sacred scriptures and the holy doctors. And he went on to say that the Pope and the church were second in authority to scripture. Now, this is heresy, especially for a priest. And so he was declared a heretic in 1415. And this was after he said those things, but he had died before he was declared a heretic. So he died from a stroke at age 56 while celebrating Mass on New Year's Eve in 1384. So he was in communion with the church. When he died, he was celebrating Mass. But after his death, he was declared a heretic. And in 1428, 43 years after his death, officials dug up his body, burned his remains, and threw his ashes into the river Swift. They're digging it up. Wycliffe's bones, this says. Here they're burning the bones in the fire. And here someone is pouring his ashes into the river Swift. This is at Lutterworth, where he was when he died. So this raises the question, can you be a martyr even though you died peaceably in communion with the church? Well, Wycliffe was a martyr only, he did it the easy way, I guess. 41 years after his death, he became a martyr. This is a chapel window at Wycliffe College in the University of Toronto, and it celebrates other Protestant reformers. Around the sides, you can see this Luther, Knox, It says Holy Bible. Wesley, Calvin, Latimer, and Jewell. And there's one here, Thomas Cranmer. You can't see, his name isn't visible, but this is the window that celebrates Wycliffe as the morning star of the revolution. And he began through his work as a translator. So that's Wycliffe's contribution. Now it's interesting to look at Wycliffe's Bible of 1388. It was the first complete Bible in English. It was in the same dialect of Middle English used by Chaucer. The Vulgate, however, is its only source. Wycliffe translated the Vulgate. He did not go back to the Hebrew or to the Greek. And it was really translated by students and followers of Wycliffe, not so much by Wycliffe himself, but he was the organizer. He translated some of it. He supervised the translation. So this was a translation by committee, unlike Jerome's translation. It's a very, very literal, unsophisticated, almost word for word translation of the Latin. And it therefore, in places, it uses Latin constructs which are almost unintelligible. But even so, it became the most common manuscript in Middle English, even though it was banned by the church and burned in 1409. Look how, this doesn't look like a manuscript. This looks like a printed Bible, but it's all written out very carefully in hand, and it's bound in leather. It's gone back and put color in it. This is what manuscripts were in the high Middle Ages. And so you can see what was happened there. Now, about 250 copies of Wycliffe's Bible have survived. And the last one at auction sold for $1.7 million in 2016. In case somebody wants to buy one and put it in our library at the church, I would guess that would be the starting bid at the auction. But this is also a Wycliffe manuscript, and notice that it's much less, you can see the lines there that looks like a scribe put lines in here to write down, and then it's still beautifully done, but it's not as expensive a manuscript certainly as the others. This is a portion from Matthew 6, which contains the Lord's Prayer. And in here it goes, "Our Father that art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." And this goes from Our Father down to the Amen. And if you were to transcribe that into print today, this is what you would get. And here is what it sounds like. And notice the difference in the language between Middle English and between Old English and Middle English. This you can almost understand.
Ure Vader, dat art in heavenes, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come to, be thy will done, in earth as in heaven. Give to us this day our bread over our substance, and forgive to us our debts as we forgive to our debtors, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Okay, we could probably recognize that as the Lord's Prayer if Wycliffe or Chaucer walked into the room and started saying it. I was fascinated, though, Give us this day our daily bread over other substance. That makes you think, doesn't it, what daily bread really means. That it's not just bread, it's what we need to exist, but not necessarily the most important part of our existence. Okay, so a quick look at, I'm not going to go through this, developments in paper and printing, paper mills in the 11th and 12th, woodblock printing in the Middle English. Paper became easily available around 1400. Mass-produced metal type in the early 15th century. Gutenberg's first printing press, 440. William Caxton's brought the first printing press to England in 1475. And then modern paper was way later, early 19th century. But this is the difference we see there. And it was really, all of these things made it possible for Gutenberg to invent the press. He built upon what had gone on just before that in his life. And this is the Gutenberg Bible. And it is it's in Latin. It is Jerome's Vulgate. So it's very strictly it conforms very strictly to the church. There's nothing controversial about it, but it's just a stunning leap forward in technology. Oh, and so this was where we were really at the end of Wycliffe's life. Now, I think I'm going to stop here because of time, but there's a lot in here. This is what I can't do today. There's a lot in here, but you know how the story comes out. It comes out with the King James Version here, and we all know that, but there's a lot that tells us here. So maybe some other time I can get to Tyndale and Geneva. Well, that's a lot. I hope you've stayed awake and listened and enjoyed these stories as much as I've enjoyed telling them. Do you have any comments or questions?
I'm curious, Bob, between the time Wycliffe's body was exhumed and burned and Henry VIII or the Reformation, when did the Wycliffe's reputation turn around? Was it after the Reformation, before, during this time when other translations were coming out?
Wycliffe was, even during his life, sort of a hero among people who opposed the Roman Catholic dominance of the English church. At first, Henry VIII was called defender of the faith. He was strongly pro-Catholic at the beginning of his reign. But then, of course, Anne Boleyn and the issue of his progeny changed all of that. But Wycliffe was respected. Much of Wycliffe's Bible was used in later translations of the Bible. So I'm not sure. I think it would depend, of course, on who you were, as to what you would have thought about Wycliffe.
Yeah.
But
well,
he was certainly respected by the reformers.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Is the King James just from Jerome's version?
Let's see, Sam, I could hear you talking, but could you get closer to the mic?
I'm not sure where it is.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
At any rate, all of these were translations of Jerome's translation. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Certainly the Wycliffe was, but later on these other Bibles that preceded the King James, especially the Geneva Bible, were translations directly from the Hebrew and the Greek. And so that's what made those later translations so much better.
So the King James incorporated those translations as well as Jerome's?
Yes, King James incorporated the Geneva Bible, and the King James incorporated Tyndale, and the King James incorporated Wycliffe. And so all of those things were building up to the King James Version. It just didn't happen. It was done with a huge committee, 47 people.
What is considered the most accurate translation available today?
Well, that's a good question. We've got scores to think of. So I can't get into that. In the first place, I don't know if I had to say about the ones I've looked at, I would say the King James and the Geneva Bibles, because they were both done using the best scholarship of their day, many sources. Okay, well, I think we're going to have to break up because I see at least the people in room 12 are probably going to have to go get ready to go to church. Bonnie?
How long did the Catholic Church use the Vulgate, or when did they give it up, or have they given it up?
They really have not given it up. They've just brought in others. And there are Catholic churches in the world together today who are pre-Vatican Council day that will have Latin masses, all in Latin, and going by the Latin Mass and using the Vulgate.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's very
You're
interesting.
welcome. It's been
Very,
fun.
very good.
Let's
Thank you
see.
very much, Bob.
You're welcome. And I think next Sunday, Jane, you're going to be leading the Faith Formation Hour. You want to say something about that?
Sure. So I'm going to try to help us answer the question of why we do what we do on Sunday mornings. We're going to walk through the order of worship and do some theological examination of it and look at practices and just sort of the way we conduct things. And we'll have time for questions. So why we do what we do on Sunday morning is really the starting point for us.
Well, we'll be looking forward to it.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
You too, Bonnie. Bye.
Okay, come down to the car. What I've got down there. My hearing aid.
What battery size do you use?
Oh, mine are different.
Yours are different.
Mine
I thought I had all.
Mine are the orange ones, you know.
Yeah, I know the orange ones.
Yeah. Okay.
It's always, where did I put it?
Yes,
Bring
yes,
them with you.
yes. Well, he
Now,
tries to
I
keep
looked
them in the
this
car,
morning,
but
Yeah.
you don't want to keep them in there too long either. If it gets too hot.